Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Computer History Museum. It's a delightful evening and a particularly interesting one from my point of view, and obviously yours or you wouldn't be here. For those that I don't know, my name's Dan Lou and I'm the CEO of the museum. I've been here a little more than 6 years, and it's my privilege to kick this program off tonight and to thank the many staff, volunteers, members, supporters, trustees, our AV staff, and everyone that puts these programs together. So without their support, we wouldn't be able to pull these things off. And we're also streaming online, and as most of you know, all these programs are captured in part of the history that we collect and then share over time. And as we aim towards the future, and we make the museum a little more programmable, pieces of these programs will be able to be pulled out by others, historians and the like, and constructing new, interesting exhibits and things to have different kinds of impact for different audiences over time. So we're pleased for this particular topic because it reaches a very broad audience. The mission of the museum is to decode technology, the computing past, which is where we get our agency, the digital present, which is where we live, and the future impact on humanity and the human condition. Because as you all know, history is not about the past. About the present, having a conversation with the past. And you're all here because you want to learn something. This is an educational institution, so we appreciate that. And it's important for us to take a look at a program like this one because it is all about the story of how the Chinese language was brought into the computer age by clever computer programmers. Now, several weeks ago, we held a program here where the Indian community gathered and talked about what was affectionately referred to as the India stack. There is a digital identity that every individual in India now has based upon a biometric. So there's 1.4 billion people who've been brought into the computer age and the digital present. That's being shared around the world. Obviously, the Chinese language is pretty fundamental to bringing more than 1 billion people also into the computing world. And so this program is a milestone for that. I want to thank our sponsor tonight. Without their support, these kinds of programs and obviously other support would not be possible. It's Bin Lin and Daisy Liu Family Foundation. So I know that Bin will be watching online. I think he's out of the country at the moment, but we want to thank he and Daisy Liu for their support of this program. Without them, we would have these conversations, and as we aspire to have the global impact that this museum will have and does have today. So tonight, this whole program was inspired by the conversation that we're going to see soon that relates to special guest Thomas Mullaney's book, The Chinese Computer. We're going to learn a lot more about that. And after the program, you'll be able to purchase a book downstairs, but also have Thomas autograph that. So I'll encourage you all to do that, and I'll remind you at the end of the program about that as well. So let me move on and introduce the speakers for tonight. I'm going to have to read because there's so much behind each of their backgrounds. So Thomas Mullaney will be coming to the stage momentarily. He's a professor of Chinese history at Stanford University. He's a Guggenheim Fellow, the recipient of Stanford's highest award for excellence in teaching called the Gores Award. So we're really looking forward to his lectures and comments later tonight. He's the author and editor of up to 8 books, including the inspiration for tonight's program, again, The Chinese Computer, A Global History of the Information Age. Thomas, would you please join me on stage? Thanks so much. Great, thank you. And also, I'd like to move on now and introduce Young Chung. She's here to moderate the conversation. She's an award-winning writer, a research scholar in law, and a fellow at Yale's Paul Tsai China Center, where her work focuses on the development of science and technology in China and the US-China relations. And before Yale, she worked at the Large Hadron Collider for over a decade. So Young, would you come to the stage, please? Thank you so much. And now I'm going to do what I do best. I'll get out of the way. You too. Take it there. Thanks.
Well, thank you so very much for spending part of your Tuesday evening with us. And I should say that it's an absolute understatement for me to say that I've been looking forward to this event for months. and been looking forward to Professor Mullaney, or we'll call Tom for tonight here, for years, since his groundbreaking, award-winning prequel, The Chinese Typewriter, came out. And so to start, I wonder how many of you here have had a chance to visit the exhibit downstairs, Revolution, that traces 2,000 years of human computing history. And if you haven't, I would highly recommend. And if you have, I had a chance to look at it earlier today. And at the entrance, there is a section about the abacus. And I remember when I was a little girl growing up in China, I had a little plastic abacus with colorful beads. And my mom actually didn't allow me toys or trinkets because she thought those were distractions to studies. But she let me play with that plastic abacus because she thought it would teach me math. And so to start with, Tom, I guess one question I would have is an abacus a Chinese computer? What makes a computer Chinese? And in your book title, The Chinese Computer, what is Chinese about it?
Thank you. Thank you. So I just want to start by saying what an absolute immense honor and pleasure it is to be here. And this project has taken up half of my adult life, a third of my life on this planet, and so it's no small thing to be able to discuss it with everyone here. This is a good question because the thing that it does not mean is a computer that is designed by exclusively those who would identify as either nationally or ethnically Chinese. The story of the Chinese computer is about what engineers might call a wicked hard problem that is, becomes a kind of intellectual super magnet for engineers and linguists and entrepreneurs and everyday users from all around the world who then gravitate to this question. I didn't do the math. If someone has their iPhone calculator, you might ask it this way, which is, if you imagine that you have 50 keys, let's say, let's just make it 50 for the sake of math, and then let's just round it up to about 100,000 Chinese characters with obviously no alphabet, no syllabary. What is 50 divided by 100,000? Once you get that number, multiply it by the number of letters in the Latin alphabet, and that's how many keys you could have on a proverbial keyboard. It's less than one. So try to imagine what a keyboard for the English language with one key would be. And not just a keyboard with one key that allows you to type in English, but a keyboard with one key that allows you to type English incredibly fast. In fact, as fast or faster than any other human-computer interaction kind of language out there. So this becomes just an absolutely engrossing puzzle that brings together Chinese American, Chinese, Japanese, German, Russian, again, engineers from around the world that center on this problem. So it's not an ethnically or nationally demarcation of the word Chinese. It centers around the writing system and the language, but also the puzzle that grips so many people over the course of the second half of the 20th century.
Thank you. And so it's the Chinese computer. In some ways, one can also call it the Sinophone computer. It's a computer that has the ability to input and process Chinese language and the Chinese script. And so one thing about this important question about whether or not the Chinese script could be recognized into a modern-day computer was really not just a technical challenge. It is a profoundly ideological and philosophical question that is about modernity. Right? Who gets to define it, who belongs in it, and whether or not this ancient script can be or become modern. So would you like to unpack some of that with us?
Sure. So prior to the age of telegraphy, prior to, think of Samuel Morse, Alfred Vail, the communication at a distance, the semaphore plus electricity plus cables and wire in British Empire, prior to that moment, there wasn't a problem with Chinese. And for that matter, there wasn't a problem with Arabic, and there wasn't a problem with Burmese, and there wasn't a problem because this era of, say, the early 19th century backwards was a time that was intrinsically multimodal. If one printing technology or inscription technology didn't work for you, movable type, you would use xylography, woodblock printing. And woodblock printing is low cost. It's easy to sort of decompose into a labor process. And you had visitors to China, what we now call China, what we now call Japan, whose jaws dropped. These were Jesuit visitors whose jaws dropped because you could buy a book in Edo for the cost of a bowl of noodle soup at a time when back in Europe, a book was a phenomenally expensive object in the era of scriptoria. So this is just to say, Chinese hasn't always been a problem. It becomes a problem out of this incongruence with a whole family of information technologies from telegraphy onward that were built with the English language in mind. They were built with the Latin alphabet in mind. And this isn't to retroactively cancel Samuel Morse or Alfred Vail. They were operating in an Anglophone English language environment. They were faced with a particular puzzle. The same thing is true of Remington, the typewriter. But where the problem does emerge and where we do have to critically reevaluate is that these technologies were actually quite narrow in their scope, really cellophane wrapped to the experience of English, were then stretched around the world in what we would now refer to as localization or internationalization. And that story was a story of colonialism and domination, where any writing system that fit the model of, say, the Remington typewriter, French, Italian, Cyrillic, Hebrew, was sort of okay. And then the great many writing systems that didn't behave in the correct compatible way were, in a sense, blamed for their incompatibility with the machine. The machine was never blamed for its incompatibility with writing systems. A sort of gestalt switch happened. And no writing system was blamed more vociferously, more kind of comically than Chinese. And this was taken deeply to heart by reformers in the late Qing, say the late 19th century, the early 20th century, and a great many Chinese modernizers and reformers, brilliant reformers, came to the altogether logical conclusion that Chinese has to go. The writing system has to go. That's the price of entry to the industrial age, to the modern age. There is one subset of Chinese reformers, however, and modernizers, who said, not so fast, not so fast. And they tried to imagine a world in which this heritage could be brought into the industrial age, but the price of entry was going to be the radical reimagination of the writing system and the radical reimagination of technology itself. And that's kind of the iconoclast that I follow through this book and the previous book.
Thank you for this brisk yet profound walk through history. And so if we come to this question about how do we input the Chinese script into a modern day computer, and one question I'd like to quick show of hands in the audience, how many of you have inputted the Chinese script into a computer or tablet phone?
Great.
Many of you. How many of you have used an input method that is not pinyin or like phonetics based?
All right.
Quite a few as well. Well, we're in for a treat. And so one thing that being particular, there are a number of really fascinating characters in your book, and there were two that stood out to me because they both tried to find ways to input the Chinese script into the modern day computer, but they come from very different backgrounds, including language backgrounds. One is an MIT-trained computer scientist, Samuel Caldwell, who was not a Chinese speaker, and he took an engineer's approach to dissecting the Chinese character, almost like one would do it with an assembly line approach, right? Looking at the shapes of the strokes and their frequencies and think about how it can be condensed into some kind of statistical pattern. And the other is a Chinese computer scientist, Zhi Bingyi, who had a really interesting experience when he was in prison during the Cultural Revolution, and he had nothing to read and not much to do, and he was, for a while, looking at just 8 characters outside his prison cell, 坦白从宽，抗拒从严. Those who confess will receive leniency, and those who resist will receive harsher sentences. And you used a really interesting metaphor in your book, and indulge me since I come from a particle physics background, where you described Zhi Bingyi turned his mind into a particle accelerator, like smashing the characters together and then taking them apart to find some innate patterns. And so unpack that metaphor a bit and tell us why is it important to take a Chinese character apart into some basic components, and how does that relate to an input method?
Yeah, thank you so much. So it comes back to that ratio that I asked someone to calculate on their iPhone of how do you get from here to there? How do you get from, again, let's round it up to 100,000 to a space of an interface, a keyboard, of say 50 keys to keep things simple? The answer is you don't. The answer is that you cannot use the conventional pattern of what you type is what you get. That if I depress the key marked A or B or C, I expect, as a form of human machine and human computer interaction, I just expect those symbols to appear on a page or a screen or so forth. That way of mapping one onto the other cannot function unless you imagine a keyboard the size of this room. And so instead, the process of mapping becomes one that is subtly but very powerfully different from mainstream English language, Anglophone human-computer interaction. And you could basically summarize it as follows. When I sit down, I'm including myself in this, when I sit down and I write by hand, or if I type on a mechanical typewriter, or if I type on my laptop, I have either the literal feeling or the impression that I'm writing something by composing it. The cat bit the dog, and the process of doing that is THE space, CAT space, and that's my experience of it. That's not how Chinese human-computer interaction works. Chinese human-computer interaction and input, or 输入法, or 输入, is a process of finding all of those elements. So I'm not typing THE in order to write THE. I'm typing something in order to computationally find the, and find cat, and find bit, and find the, and find dog. So what Chinese human-computer interaction is actually about retrieval. It's about search writing. And what you're doing on the keyboard is you're providing basically criteria that instructs a computational program as to what character you want it to find from memory. The reason that that's so important is that as compared to the cat bit the dog, for which there is only one correct way of doing that, there are a theoretically infinite number of ways to map the letters of the keyboard, the letters of the Latin alphabet, onto the process of searching for characters. Once you go to the realm of search, you have an infinite number of theoretical possibilities as to what the letter A even means, or B means, or C means. Now today, the vast majority of Chinese speakers, or those that are typing in Chinese, will use a particular kind of mapping that is phonetic, where I'm actually typing out, using the letters of the Latin alphabet, the sound of whatever character I'm after. But for the vast majority of the history of Chinese computing, in the 50s, and the 60s, and the 70s, in most of the 80s, that was not the mapping of choice. Computer engineers around the world thought that phonetic input was the worst of all possible ways of doing the mapping. It's ambiguous. The code lengths are all different sizes. The best way to do it is to use the letters of the Latin alphabet to represent the shapes and component pieces of the Chinese character as a structural graphical form. And so these two figures, Samuel Caldwell at MIT and Zhi Bingyi in Shanghai, they come at this through that idea of structure, but their systems are completely different. So in the case of Caldwell, he ends up having dinner time conversations with overseas Chinese students at MIT. And they're just like eating food. They're family friends of Joyce Chun, of the famous Joyce Chun cookbook. And so Betty Caldwell is making recipes from Joyce Chun's Chinese cookbook to sort of make Caldwell's students feel at home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And over the course of these dinner time conversations, get to talking about the Chinese language, how it works. and that there is stroke order, that there is a spelling to Chinese characters. There's a way that you write Chinese characters. If you take 5 different people, give them a pencil or a pen and say, write this Chinese character, they will follow the same sequence of strokes. That blows Caldwell's mind, and he says, I could build a logical circuit for that. Not to build a character stroke by stroke the way that you use letters to build a word, but as a search algorithm, effectively, where we have the characters in photographic memory, and we're using a computer to find it from memory using these spellings as a search retrieval mechanism. And so the very first Chinese computer, the Sinotype, as it was called, that's developed by Caldwell and his team at the Graphic Arts Research Foundation, was a search engine, you could say. It was a process of retrieving characters from memory. Zhi Bingyi, by contrast, he's suffering in prison during the Red Guard period of the Cultural Revolution, the opening few years of the Cultural Revolution, the part of the Cultural Revolution that is best known to sort of popular memory. He was placed in solitary confinement, and he, by all accounts, was going to go insane. He had lost his profession, he was estranged from his loved ones and family, and all he had was this terrifying couplet to meditate on for months and months and months and months and years. And he had managed to smuggle and secret away a pen that were used for self-confessions, the 自我批评. But he had no paper. And so instead he used the reverse side of a teacup to secretly write down characters and then imagine exploding them into component pieces, and then trying to take those component pieces he had exploded with his mind and assign each of those little fragmentary subatomic particles one letter of the Latin alphabet. And so he started to work through in his mind what a kind of information retrieval system for Chinese would look like. And when he gets out of prison after the Cultural Revolution, he brings that into the realm of computing. And ends up signing contracts with major precision engineering firms in Germany and also in the United States.
I feel that I could listen to Tom tell stories forever. And so, but this, speaking of this, so in terms of the script or graphic-based input, and I remember when I was in middle school in the early 2000s, and actually my mother signed me up for some of the Wubi input classes. And how many of you here have used or learned some of that? A few, maybe from a similar generation in China. But later when I was actually at a university and started using computers more frequently, it was really the phonetics-based input method that was dominant. And so, and earlier you talked about, right, like now the phonetic or the pinyin-based input method, it has become dominant or displaced a lot of the script-based methods, even though they are not obsolete. But that was really not how the way the thinking started, and there were a lot of drawbacks to a phonetic-based method. And one of them is also that part of the beauty of the Chinese script or the Chinese writing system is that the same writing system can accommodate a variety of languages with very different pronunciations, as well as some syntax and word usage. And however, if you want to have a pronunciation, a phonetics-based input, there needs to be some form of standardization. And so tell us a little bit about what are the motivations behind prioritizing a pinyin or phonetics-based input method, and what was gained and lost in that process?
Yeah, thank you. So once we get to the late 1980s and early 1990s, that really is the beginning of a serious takeoff of this new way of mapping Chinese onto a keyboard using the letters of the Latin alphabet to spell the sounds of Chinese characters. So as I alluded, if you were to sit down with an engineer in the 60s or 70s and said, just rank the techniques you think are from best to worst, they would have put phonetic dead last every time. There were a number of problems with phonetic, not the least of which is that there are single phonemes, there are single pronunciations, let's just say, for simplicity's sake, in Chinese, that correspond to dozens of different Chinese characters. Li, Yi. If I write Y-I or L-I, that is an incredibly ambiguous sort of input thing. And so what it requires is an incredibly computationally intensive process where the computer has to disambiguate from a whole set of possibilities. Contrast that to structure-based input, where quite literally the inventor of the input system could lock himself in a room for 15 years with a Chinese dictionary and try to perfect and fine-tune his system so that no input sequence mapped onto any more than 4 or 5 or 6 possible candidates. They are synthetic, they're artificial, they can be created. But Chinese is a language that goes back millennia, and so you can't just engineer it however you want. And so for this reason, phonetics was understood as dead last. What changes is that it turns out that pinyin, Hanyu pinyin, this phonetic way of inputting characters, its greatest strength comes from its greatest weakness. Its greatest weakness is inputting one character at a time. When you input one character at a time, there's a ton of ambiguity that the computer has to deal with. But most words in the modern Chinese language are not built out of one Chinese character. They're built out of 2. So if you think of the word for student, 学生, you think of meeting, 会议, you think of whatever, 大学, so university, 2 characters. And so beginning in the 70s and 80s, a sort of subset of engineers around the world started to say, what if we set for ourselves not the goal of inputting one character at a time, but inputting compounds at a time, or for that matter, 4 character sequences at a time. And in that case, suddenly, we can get into the weeds of this in the Q&A perhaps, suddenly Hanyu pinyin started to have incredible possibility and incredible affordances. And this is what you see. I'm sure anyone here who raised their hand saying that they have inputted something has definitely used one of the techniques that I'm talking about, which is if you're going to type in, let's say, Beijing, the capital of mainland China, Beijing, you can write B-E-I-J-I-N-G. That will get you where you are going. But you can also write B-J, the first letter of each of the 2 values. And the computer has a lot to go on, because if I could anthropomorphize the computer, which I don't like to do, but let's just do it for one's sake, the computer can say BJ. There is no valid Chinese word that has that pronunciation. And I can use that and say, okay, what this user wants is a 2-character word that is in my dictionary, that is meaningful, that's real, in which the first value of the first character is a B, and the first value of the second character is a J. And once that's what I'm looking for, the number of possibilities collapses. There are some differences, Beijing, background Beijing, the capital, but they're very, very, very few. And so suddenly, once we get past moving 1 character at a time to 2, it's kind of like this thing has legs now. The idea is this thing has legs, but there's a huge advantage to anyone who can make phonetic Chinese input work, which is that in the story of Wubi, if you're going to learn Wubi or any of the other structure-based input systems invented since the beginning of computing, that means that you have to go to like the bookstore, buy a special manual, watch the equivalent of YouTube videos in your spare time and like learn how to do it. Or literally the inventors of that input system will start a company where they're literally publishing manuals and starting classes in how to do this. Well, Pinyin has a little bit of a better budgetary surplus. It has the entire Ministry of Education of the People's Republic of China behind it. Because Hanyu Pinyin is taught to preschoolers. From the very beginning of literacy, the education system in the PRC is teaching people Hanyu Pinyin, the system. So think about it. You're an inventor now. And which one am I going to work on? Am I going to create my own bespoke, custom design input system and then have to carry the burden of teaching every one of my consumers how to do it? Or am I going to piggyback on the Chinese government to do that for me and then build one? And this is part of the story of how we get from one to the other. And it has huge implications because effectively, input systems that are phonetic require the user to effectively train themselves in standard Chinese. Even if you are a Cantonese speaker who does not speak standard Chinese or a speaker of Shanghainese or Fujianese, and you just literally don't speak standard Chinese, you kind of have to learn enough of it in order to input using phonetic pinyin. So now, phonetic pinyin serves a kind of nation formation, standardization tool in the toolkit. But it comes at a cost because I start the book off with a typing competition, like different people competing with one another to input Chinese characters faster. Hands down, over and over and over again, Wubi and structure-based input wipes the floor with phonetic input. It is still faster than phonetic input. It's just that to achieve that level, you kind of have to teach yourself. You can't rely upon the Ministry of Education to teach it for you.
So my mother is an elementary school teacher, so I actually learned pinyin from her. And so listening to Tom tell this story brings me back many childhood memories. And I think one consistent theme in your book is about like technology. On one hand, it opens up a lot of different possibilities. On the other hand, it can also be often in service of hegemonic power. And then in the course of it, there is also like questions about resources, and a lot of these are also by chance. And speaking of by chance, I was wondering whether the graphics could put up the cover of Tom's book, because I would really like to ask a story about a very, very special person who is on the cover of the book. This is from an IBM brochure in the late 1940s. And the individual, this is not an artistic rendition, but this is a photo of a real person, Lois Lou. And she was a young woman at the time, and she actually just passed away several months ago at almost 100 years old, and she lived an absolutely remarkable life. And what is also remarkable is that you interacted with her several times. Tell us a bit about your interactions and her story.
Thank you. Yeah, I was very much hoping that we'd get a chance to talk about her. So I'm 45. I've worked on this for 16 years, so it's a third of my life on this planet and half of my adult life. And when you work on something for 16 years, you lose people along the way. In writing this, I lost my mother and my father, and a very close friend who I also want to kind of respect and honor in memory, Bruce Rosenblum. Just an amazing, amazing individual. I think many people in this room may professionally know him. And the final person who was lost, not unexpectedly, given just how an incredibly wonderful and long life she led, was Lois Lou. So it was in the page proofs when I had to ask my editor if it's okay for me to change the verb tense for some people who, when I was finished, they were with us, and now they're gone. And so Lois Lou passed in the very last few weeks. So the story, maybe I'll start it from how we met and then how I learned her story. When I started working on this book, at the inception, it was this book and the book I published before, The Chinese Typewriter, was one thing. But it became, over the course of the first 9 years, self-evident to me that if I was going to do justice to the history after the Second World War and the history of computing, either it was going to be an 800-page book and it was going to cost me tenure, and no one would read it and it would never get finished, or it had to be two. And so I spoke to my editor and said, would you consider this living as two autonomous, completely separate things, but as two? And they said yes. And it was at that point when I sort of clicked and dragged all of the material, and I gave it a folder name, computer, and just moved it, and I didn't think about it. There was one chapter, though, that was really hard to decide, which was the chapter on the IBM electric Chinese typewriter, which was debuted as a prototype in 1947. It's a typewriter, it's a Chinese typewriter, so it kind of belongs in the first book, but it's electro-automatic, it has a keyboard interface, so it's kind of quasi-computational, and it was a judgment call, and eventually I clicked and dragged it and brought it into computer, and so therefore it was going to wait another 8 years to see the light of day. And the universe was on my side when I made that decision, because it was in that interim when I had a blog at the time. I had posted some video content of an IBM 1947 basically historic film that showed the Chinese typewriter and showed this young woman that was operating it. And I got a comment saying, "Thank you for the memories. I'm the woman in the film." And I was like, no, you're not. That's impossible. it's not possible. I mean, you would be, I mean, I didn't say this but I just, and fortunately, I had spent time in the Shanghai Municipal Archives in microfilm, and I found the only source to this day I've ever seen that had this young woman's Chinese name in Chinese characters. And so I sort of sent a coded message. I was like, it's very nice to meet you. It's an honor to meet you. Would you mind telling me what your name is in Chinese? And she wrote back, and it was correct. And there's no person on planet Earth that could have known. But then one thing led to another, and we didn't connect. And then it was about 7 years later when a family friend of Lois Lou reached out once more, and this time we did get to speak, and I got the phone number, I called, and I kid you not, the very first words out of her mouth were, "You've been looking for me for a long time." And I said, "Yes." And so we spoke for just under 2 hours, and she just lived an unbelievable life. She grew up she was a young girl with the outbreak of the war, the Second World War. She told stories of her family as refugees fleeing south, carrying her sister on her back. Her mother, after they had sort of taken up refuge in Hong Kong area, trying to arrange a marriage for her, and just basically on the basis of a single photograph of some man that was in the United States arranging a marriage for her, and she boarded a ship by herself. She crossed the ocean by herself. She took a train by herself, and then she met this man she had never seen in life before, and they were married in Rochester, New York. And she got a job at IBM working in a factory. And then this Chinese-American engineer, Gao Zhongqin, comes up with this, working together with IBM, comes up with this prototype of the IBM Chinese typewriter. And IBM needed a demonstrator, someone to demonstrate the machine. And circuitously, she got the job. Now, let me just tell you what this machine entails, and then I'll turn it right back to you, Yang, because I could go on, well, I could go on for 16 years about this, apparently. The Chinese typewriter, the electric Chinese typewriter by IBM, has a metal drum inside that rotates at 60 revolutions per minute. It is etched with wrong-reading Chinese characters on the metal drum. But the user never sees them. That's inside a chassis. It's like a metal hard drive. You never ever see it. The face of it is a keyboard. The first ever really keyboard-based electro-automatic Chinese machine. But on this keyboard, there are no Chinese characters. There are no letters even. There are numbers. There's a bank of 0 through 6, 0 through 9, 0 through 9, 0 through 9. And in order to type a Chinese character, you have to input a unique 4-digit numerical cipher from 0001 to 5999, and it's do or die. There's no pop-up menu. There's no chance of checking your work. You do it or you don't. And she did it. She memorized these codes. She demonstrated the machine in front of audiences 3, 4, 5 times larger than this audience, including heads of state, including journalists from major news outlets, on IBM's product tour. Talk about the pressure that she was under. And when I spoke to her on the phone, she closed the session, the phone, and she just said, you know, I said, it's very hard as an historian to ask about embodied history, like how do we get things into our body? We can't really, as human beings, explain how we learn how to ride a bike. And she said, you know, how did you do it? She said, I don't know, I just did it, I just remember. I remember, you know, and I don't even remember, I can't even remember. She's like, 7232, ni, 1739, wo. And I'm like, whatever the numbers were. I got off the phone, and I was like, there's no way. There is no, she's just saying numbers. But I had already worked at the Museum of Business History Technology in Delaware that has one of the last surviving prototypes of the IBM electric typewriter, and I have all the photographs of all the code books, and you best believe that I got into my iPhoto, and I'm like going through, and I'm like, you have got to be kidding me. They're all correct. All of the ones that she just rattled off at the end of the phone call are correct, and this was 70 years after her job was done. So just an amazing individual, lovely family, and friends, and I'm so glad that I dragged and dropped the right folders into that folder when I made that choice.
Oh, I feel that Lois Lou deserves a round of applause from all of us. And in your book and in your description as well, right, she demonstrated the IBM, the Chinese word input processor, was not a full computer yet,
right.
To all kinds of journalists, business executives, dignitaries. And in your book, you actually have this really striking photo which features Lois Lou's predecessor demonstrating the machine Grace Cow, and she was surrounded by a large group of all men. And I think on one hand, when I look at that photo, I think a flip side of that photo would be this usually male inventor at the center, and then a large group of usually female labor who are working as typists or who are doing these types of work. And when I was visiting the exhibit downstairs, and one thing that I also noted, I don't know how many of you have seen the film or read the book Hidden Figures, right? Not that long ago in the mid-20th century, when it was a lot of women, and often women of color, who were working as typists, as programmers, doing the work of scientific computing, and who were literally called computers. And there is this evolution from the women of color who's working as the computer to this present-day image of a usually male and often white tech bro. And so I was wondering whether you would like to talk a bit about this gender dimension of this evolution of the public perception of computer and computing labor, and in particular in the context of the Chinese computer when it also intersects with race and ethnicity.
Yeah, thank you. So to quote or to cite the titles of two works that are classics in the field, When Computers Were Human and When Computers Were Women, the first, Lois Lou, was the first IME. It's when IMEs were human, when IMEs were women. She had to hold in herself the entire algorithm, so to speak, which then is subsequently externalized and programmatized, and its history is lost. So in some senses, it maps on to a larger history, a global history where we see this process. The interesting thing is that in the larger history of Chinese information technology, if we back up for just a moment and we look at take basically both books together in the 19th century all the way up to the present, that China was simultaneously inside these larger Western-dominated global narratives of, say, the typewriter girl, the idea of the feminized clerical labor, the feminized secretary, the feminized typist, and so forth, that was dominant in the United States and gets exported elsewhere. You had that image as well. You had the idea, which was celebrated, which was written about in Chinese newspapers, of the Chinese typewriter girl, the attractive secretary, all of these sorts of things. But when you go through the archival documents of, say, 1920s and 30s typing schools, like I like to spend my time doing, and you just read through thousands of names and demographic information, you find out that roughly 30 to 40% of the student body were men. And that actually, so there's a sort of, there's a part of the history that maps completely on. It follows all of the tropes, all of the idioms, all of the cliches of this larger narrative. But there's also this noise in the history. There's this noise in the system that doesn't map on to the history that we know. And the reason we don't know about it is because there's no word for it, there's no name for it, and the reason that there's no name for it is that the whole naming practice is borrowing a page from largely the US history to it. And so that's one thing that this book is, and these two books are trying to be an invitation to, is not to close the book, so to speak, close the book on and say this is supposed to be the definitive history of Chinese computing and sort of that's it, here it is, go find it, but an invitation that this is me going into this space, bringing back the stories and the arguments that are the best that I could do in these 16 years, but please come into the water, come into the pool, because there is so much more here. And some of it will map onto the global history of computing that we know well, and some of it just doesn't. And so hopefully it's also an invitation to other colleagues, students, future students. I have some students in the audience, to sort of say, come into this space because there's so much more to be thought of and done. And this is just, I mean, and we're China is a big category, as a global population, it's large, but this is also a story of Japanese computing, Korean, South Asian, Southeast Asian, Arabic and Arabic derived. We really know very little about the global history of computing. Less than one might imagine given its importance in our lives today. And so it's sort of an invitation also to the entrance into those arenas as well.
Yeah, and so so the technology, right, it is a product of power. It can reproduce existing power relations or it can challenge it. And I think your two books, The Chinese Typewriter and Chinese Computer, are beautiful illustrations of that uneven power relations. And so speaking of, for example, Lois Lou, she operated this prototype that was designed or put forth by IBM. And for these American-based international conglomerates who are trying to enter the Chinese market at the time with a large population and a potential lucrative future market. So there is this commercial motivation. And there are also, in the advent of the Cold War, there are geopolitical motivations, which brings us to an old friend we just talked about, Samuel Caldwell at MIT. And so I know that there's this really interesting story about Samuel Caldwell when he was initially trying to apply for funding for his cyanotypes, and he was initially not successful, and then he got some advice from his mentor, Vannevar Bush, and was successful. Tell us a bit about that and what motivates US companies or other funders to pursue Chinese computers.
Yeah, so after this fateful set of dinners at Caldwell's dinner table with some ultimately very influential figures coming out of the MIT program, he sets out on this sort of prototype. He starts to work with a professor of Chinese from Harvard. They select a set of 2,000 characters. They try to decompose all of those Chinese characters into the right spelling, the stroke order. He does this incredible frequency analysis of different strokes, and it's starting to bear fruit, meaning that it really does seem like it has wings. It could take off, and now he's got to get funding. And everything in the archival record indicates that for Caldwell, this really was a story of understanding and global connection, and the world was never hurt by the possibility of greater communication. And so the initial application materials that were put together, very interestingly, was the expansion of the cyanotype to both Chinese and Devanagari. That is South Asian, one of the largest scripts and its derivatives for South Asian languages. The idea being that if we could crack these two nuts, everything else sort of falls into place, because these two problems, Chinese computing and Hindi or Devanagari computing, are so outside of the box when it comes to, again, English language dominated systems, that if we can figure out how to do this, then we really can globalize the story of communication. And that application's rejected. And Vannevar Bush says, make it about the Cold War. Make it about the Cold War. You have already had some entreaties and sort of people from what we would think of as the intelligence services coming and asking about this. There's an obvious kind of appeal that whoever possesses a machine capable of mass-producing Chinese language texts would be at an immense advantage from the purpose of psychological operations, from propaganda and so forth. You could publish and disseminate via B-2, bombers, an untold quantity of propaganda material as compared to as if Mao and the PRC gets there first. And so Caldwell thinks a little bit and decides to kind of repackage. It's not a lot of repackaging, just a little bit, and gets the money. And then gets more money and gets more money, and it funds the program. But I think there's nothing in his, he even writes about it sort of almost apologetically in some of his public writing. He kind of says, now why would the military be interested in this, you might ask? And so it is, and this is a story that, I mean, the Taiwanese military is backing the first backers of what becomes the IPX ideographics machine developed by the Taiwanese-American inventor Chen Ye, whose papers are housed at the Computer History Museum. Just a brilliant person, probably the closest to the cliche of the Steve Jobs of Asia, like that sort of thing that people like to bandy about. He's the closest version of that. An amazing individual who also passed away in the course of my time working on this. His first backers, and he's very open about this, is the Taiwanese military. I mean, they're just, in fact, they learn of his patent and call almost immediately saying, like, we're going to fund you, and this is exclusively to us. And it's only after a number of years of development when it's, when with Taiwanese military permission, it's commercialized and then utterly changes the printing, newspaper publishing industry in Taiwan, the tax collection, the yellow pages industry. So there's this undercurrent that is propelling this forth, which is connected to classic, commercial and geopolitical interests, and the other one being breaking into the China market. Since basically the late 1800s, Remington tried to break into the China market and failed. Olivetti tried and failed. Mergenthaler Linotype tried and failed. IBM tried and failed. And the list goes on. And the reason that they tried is because they wanted to make money, and the reason that they failed is because structurally, but also conceptually, they needed to protect their starting point. Their starting point, think of the Remington machine, okay? The Remington typewriter is not just a typewriter. A typewriter, any material object, any commodity you hold, is just the silhouette of a factory. And it's a silhouette of a factory and a labor supply and a process. And so if I'm going to change the Remington typewriter to the point where it can materially handle Chinese, I'm going to have to rip down my factories and rebuild them from scratch in a totally different image. And I'd prefer not to do that because this is selling really well in the rest of the world. And so they tried to bring it in with minimal modification, and of course they just couldn't do it. But ultimately, at the end of the day, by the second half of the 20th century, that's when you start to have inroads into the China market by the likes of IBM and others. But the credit for those inroads come from figures like Gao Zhongqin, come from figures like Samuel Caldwell, who turned a corner. And this brings us all the way back to the beginning of our discussion. They gave up because they knew that they had to give up on the idea of what you type is what you get. They had to give up on the myth of immediate human-machine interaction, where depression equals impression. And they said, that's not going to work. We actually have to embrace mediation. We have to embrace there being additional steps in the process. And we have to somehow be okay with that because A, it's the only way to do it, and B, it turns out, as figures like Lois Lou, who had a middle school education, she was not a Hidden Figures polymath, graduating at age 12, and so she lived a very average sort of life that many live, and she was memorizing 5,000 ciphers by heart. And so IBM and other engineers had to wrap their mind around, maybe it's possible for a large economy, a large consumer base, to interact with machines in this way, even though for us English speakers, it seems completely beyond the pale of what is possible.
Well, speaking of the Cold War, I think many of us here would feel echoes of it today in terms of
Yes.
US-China relations, which will bring us to twinned paired questions from me and before we open it up to the floor, so please get your questions ready. And I'm not sure whether there will be a microphone being passed around to take questions from the floor. And so speaking of this, this is also related to what you were talking about, right? In terms of how with English language hegemony and the dominance of machinery, whether it's the typewriter, the keyboard, or the computers that were designed for the English language or the Latin alphabet. And so the designers and the programmers, the scientists, whatever background they come from, trying to design Chinese language input and later also like word processing and displays, need to kind of like tinker from the margins, but then with that process, bring in completely different ways of thinking the functions at the core, which are not just used for language processing, but also for computer displays and music inputs and things like that. And so which brings to a question that is kind of like at the center of this US-China quote-unquote tech race or tech Cold War, that is, can China or Chinese people innovate? Right, and that question, of course, kind of like tinged with Orientalism and things like that. But then at the core of that question, the flip side is what does innovation actually mean, right? It doesn't necessarily mean building something from scratch, but the people who are, you call like the modders, the hackers who are tinkering from the edges are also doing types of innovation. So would you like to talk a bit about that?
Sure, yes. So this is, I'll cut it into two pieces and I'll try to be not as verbose as I normally am, but the first one is that, and I talk about this in the second half of the book, is once we get to the 1980s and you would visit what is now the Haidian district, like Electronics Street and so forth in Beijing, the beginning of the PC in China. These are store-bought, off-the-shelf, Western manufactured machines. One is called, for anyone who will know this, the Chromemco, named after Crothers Memorial Hall, the dorm at Stanford where the two founders were living. And so this export of these Western-built machines to China, and these are kind of really attractive, really interesting machines. They're beyond the purchasing power of the average person, but work units are buying it and so forth. The problem is that none of them out of the box work with Chinese, none of them. Out-of-the-box printers, out-of-the-box sort of monitors, out-of-the-box, every last piece of this assemblage of what we think of as just a home computer had to be modded or hacked. And so one of the examples, I'll give one, BIOS, basic input-output software, was all hacked. There's a variety of things, but one of my favorites is hacking a dot matrix printer driver. So in the case, so impact printing, the laying down of a series of dots in sequence, for those of you who have never seen anything besides a laser or an inkjet printer, the creation of a line of text through the sequence of carefully placed dots in a bitmap, raster grid. Well, for the minimum legibility, let's say, a kind of ugly but at least legible string of Latin alphabetic letters and Arabic numerals, you can get away with laying down a string of, say, 7 dots high. So you can go eat, 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 and you can get like a line of, the cat bit the dog. And so the earliest printer heads that would be installed in a dot matrix printer would have a needle pattern. So literally the metal pins that would, protrude and go into the ink ribbon and onto the piece of paper was typically 9 pins high, thereabouts. Well, you cannot have a legible Chinese character that is 9 dots high or 8 dots high or 7 dots high. It just cannot be done. Basically, the industry, at least in the mainland China, said minimum 16 dots high, 16. What ends up happening is that if you just use an impact printer to try to type Chinese, basically Chinese ends up looking like a children's book, or like a large format book for someone who's slightly hard of viewing, compared to this tight line of Latin alphabetic letters and then these clumsy, huge, clunking Chinese characters that go along it. It's just aesthetically ridiculous to look at. And so this one subset of the many modders that I talk about in that part of the book said, well, that's not going to work. Well, what if we basically trick the dot matrix printer to only advance the platen a fragment of an inch So not like lay down one line and then literally lay the other line underneath it and then get these comically oversized Chinese characters. Let's lay down one line of dots and then rotate the platen just a little bit. And then we'll tuck the other dots in between those dots, kind of like a zipper, kind of like teeth of a zipper. So we can get 16 dots, but we can get them in this super tight pattern that is at least as aesthetically pleasing as the Latin alphabetic counterpart. So there's just a ton of stories like this that happen in this really critical period of 1980s computing that then is completely forgotten about, because then you start to have 24-dot printers and you start to have retrofitted or later versions of BIOS or operating systems that accommodate things like Chinese input. Basically, Western manufacturers, Western computers, are sort of aware of these modifications that are happening, and someone is saying, that's a really, really good mod. Let's make it part of the standard operating system moving forward. And by now, if you walk in and buy a Dell at Best Buy or buy a MacBook, you will have dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of input systems and keyboards preloaded on your machine. Every one of your computers is a Chinese computer by now, and you just need to choose it from the menu. We sometimes attribute Apple with that universalism, or Microsoft with being so universal and so Catholic, and that is not the story of Windows and Apple, however. That's the story of the fringes, the margins of global technology, trying to make these things work for their languages. And then those companies saying, that's a good modification, let's make that standard. And effectively, that story of 80s modding is sort of lost in the shuffle. We forget that that's where it came from. And then the other part of it, I guess, is that you get to this place by, say, the 90s and the 2000s, where if you were to sit down in front of, you go to a Starbucks in Wuhan, you go to a Starbucks in Chengdu, you go to a Starbucks in Shanghai, and you're just there, and you crack your laptop open because you're on a business trip and you're typing out something in English, and you can look left or right and see someone else on their MacBook, someone else on their Dell, and you get this sense, this uncanny sense of, wow, the world is finally like us. It's like it all looks the same now. The computer has won. It's a computerization of the world. But if you kind of peer over that person's shoulder and look at how that person is using the QWERTY keyboard, at that point you realize, wow, that individual is using the QWERTY keyboard in ways that I don't use the QWERTY keyboard. And well, look at that. That person over there is also using the QWERTY keyboard in ways that the QWERTY keyboard was never designed to be used. And then you start tallying up, and you realize that 51% of the global population, I'll just sort of give it a nice round number, it's 51% of the global population who uses computers and human-computer interaction in a way that computers were never meant to be used. So now the compensation, the compensatory technology, which at one point was about catching up with the West and catching up with Anglophone computing, is now the dominant mode of interacting with your average off-the-shelf computer. And yet, largely the Western computational world still goes to that Starbucks in Yokohama and says, I recognize this, not realizing that the world has changed.
Yeah, and with that, we'll come to the audience questions. And actually related to, Tom, your comment just now, we got a comment that was about how Chinese or Asian language input methods have also influenced the Western use with emojis and emoticons. And actually, downstairs, you'll see this tall wall with different types of emojis that are being designed. And with that, there are a number of, so I'm grouping, we have a lot of really enthusiastic participation. I'll group a few questions together and then combine that with the last question from from myself, which is, what are some of the new frontiers in terms of Chinese language input beyond the hegemony of the pinyin input methods. And with that, there is a note from me as well in terms of in your book, you mentioned there are these cloud-based methods as well. And one thing with these faster methods, they're often based on predictability, which also means that it needs to do surveillance. And so there is a genuine security concern in terms of the input process with data storage, transmission, collections, transmission, and storage. So I was wondering if you could address both of that.
Sure. No, it's funny because it was on this stage, I don't remember how many years ago, if it was 10 years ago, that I gave a lecture called How to Spy on 600 Million People. And it was basically a sort of speculative indication that every input system by its very nature is like a computational keylogger, kind of like the one that a suspicious spouse uses on their partner to try to see who they're emailing. You know, this thing that intercepts keystrokes and does something to those keystrokes, except it is fundamentally sort of about getting text into the thing. Well, when you realize that input, that shurufa, that input method editors are essentially communication technologies. I like to call them auto-telecommunication. They are communication at a distance with oneself. You're not sending a code to a second party who is then decoding that and being like a telegram. You're sending a coded message that goes through the system and bounces back to you, boomerangs back in the form of the pop-up menu. You confirm which one you want, you go it. Any act of telecommunications is interceptable. And what this means is that at least at a company level, at a corporate level, optimization, just sort of quality control behooves any company that makes an input system capture that data, see where it's breaking down, where it's doing well, and optimizing on that basis. And what that means, and we know this from the post-9/11 era, we know this from the Snowden revelations, that all it takes is a clandestine phone call from whatever intelligence service to say, hello, Sprint, turn over this data, and do not let the world know what we have just requested from you. It is entirely within the realm of possibility that someone says, turn over the input data. And what this means is that it doesn't matter if actually someone ever ended up sending an email to somebody or literally printing a Microsoft Word document. All that had to happen was the act of inputting, and in theory, there is some kind of potentially interceptable telecommunication. It turned out that on that day, without ever meaning, I joined the ranks of becoming a futurist. So I feel like I should get like a membership to that place down in Palo Alto, because it was like a year ago that I think a group that operate in sort of security had released a study that says that there is a security concern with Chinese input method editors. And I wrote to some of the authors. I was like, do you like to read history? Maybe you should pay attention to what historians are doing this, because it's clearly there, it's clearly present. On the flip side of that, in the sort of more optimistic side of the world, this comes back to the notion of what does it mean when you are writing by searching? Remember, we talked about that before. When you're writing not to compose the cat bit the dog, but you're trying to find computationally the word the cat bit the dog. I've already said that there are a theoretically infinite number of ways to map that retrieval process onto the letters A through Z and the Arabic numerals 0 through 9. But there are many kinds of infinity, and there's an even bigger infinity, which is haptics. I could also retrieve the cat bit the dog through gesture, through certain hand motions, effectively in the realm of what I call in the book hypography, that is writing through searching. Anything that is recordable is eligible as an input sequence. Anything that can be recorded. So think of David Byrne and electronic musicians turning buildings or turning bananas into like a musical instrument digital interface with electrodes and bananas, or Byrne turning a whole building into effectively a MIDI keyboard. The same is technically possible in the realm of writing. And that is just an interesting world to live in. And this is not just the realm of electronic musicians and artists and installation artists. I'll come back to this. Arguably, the majority of the global population of the world is living hypergraphically with regard to human-computer interaction, not orthographically, or whatever we want to call the age we've been living in since people were, impressing in cuneiform. We are now more hypergraphic as a human civilization than we are compositional or orthographic. What does that mean? What does that mean? And really, the only two major arenas in human experience that have ever seriously spent long times thinking about that. One are non-Western writing systems, and the other is disability technology. Those are the only two realms where serious thought about hypography has happened. I don't know if anyone here knows, but if you remember T9 input, that started as a disability technology that was meant to be worn on one's eyes as goggles for someone along the lines of Stephen Hawking, who does not have use of their arms, as basically a disambiguation engine that would be eye-operated for the selection of text from a set of 8 options at any given moment. And then at some point along the way, TJIC and other people said, well, we'll continue to look at this as a disability technology, but we could also put it on a Samsung. And use it there. And we don't know where this is going. Think of the incunabula period of the Gutenberg Revolution, the first 50 years of print. No one knew where it was going. We are in the incunabula right now of hypography, of search writing. We don't know where it's going, but we do know that anyone that clings to a realm of what you type is what you get, and the myth of immediacy, ...
So on that, short answers. Let's try to get through
Yes.
a few more questions. Okay. And so I'll put two questions together since they are both about linguistic hegemony, but in two different ways. One is, how has Mandarin hegemony as reflected in Chinese input methods, especially phonetic input methods, affected minority languages, and especially coming from your background, since your first book was about ethnic classification in China? And the second question is, English hegemony in particular, the programming languages of today are mostly based on the English language.
Oh.
So are there any alternatives to that, for example, based on the Chinese script?
Sure. I'll be very, very brisk. So Mandarin language hegemony is absolutely pervasive within minority language policies. And the simplest way to put that is in the early 1950s, when the early years of the People's Republic of China, right after the 1949 revolution, the end of the Civil War, the new state invested phenomenal amounts of energy, time to creating a multinational, multi-ethnic People's Republic of China. And one of the examples was, for any recognized minority group whose language was spoken only, they would invest the energy and time to create a script for that writing system for the purposes of cultural preservation. The overwhelming number of the newly invented writing systems for once solely oral writing systems were all based on the Latin alphabet according to Hanyu Pinyin phonetic values. So the idea is let's say you are Shaoshu Minzu X, you're ethnic minority X, you have an oral system, your language has nothing to do with Chinese at all. It's completely linguistically separate. When we walk in there, we're going to use the Latin alphabet because there's reasons, that's a good reason, that's a good neography way to do things. But what does A mean? What does B mean? What are the values of diphthongs? What is the pronunciation? Are we going to invent an entirely new way of pronouncing these different diphthongs? No. If there is a value from standard Mandarin Hanyu Pinyin, we're going to copy and paste that into this new writing system. Why? Because what that means is that every step that a minority takes to learn their own language, they're also taking a step to learn Hanyu Pinyin. So it serves the role both of equality and nationalization at the same time. And then later on, once you get to the story of input systems, then effectively that process continues. There are ethnic minorities who had pre-existing writing systems. This is not the story for them, Tibetan, for example. But for any newly invented scripts, the idea was we're going to nationalize from the word go throughout this process. English language dominance, I mean, the simplest way to put it is that there is not a single password on planet Earth that is not ASCII. Not a single one. No banking passport, no no email password. There is no password that is Arabic or Chinese. There might be a phoneticization or a romanization, but the architecture of the American Standard Code for Information Interchange runs very, very deep. If you were to right-click on the BBC, the BBC India site, if you right-click on it and say show source code, it's English, with little text passages that have Hindi or Arabic or whatever it might be. So the book is not, I hope I'm not disappointing anyone, is not an emancipatory story. It is not about the overcoming of Latin and alphabetic dominance. Latin alphabetic dominance is alive and well. But what has happened, it's still the atmosphere of Earth at this particular moment. But there are immense sub-atmospheres, kind of think of them as like biospheres on the surface of Mars, these artificial biospheres that have been created inside this overall planetary atmosphere, which are immense, that are large enough to encompass many hundreds of millions of users. And in fact, again, more than 50% of the globe is stitched together with these sub-atmospheric kind of biospheres in which one's language can function. But Latin alphabetic dominance is alive and well.
Well, speaking of concentrated power, there are a number of questions on this, so I feel that I'm obligated to ask you, what is your view on large language models? And then to flip that, since you cannot predict history, predict the future, you can write alternative history. What would an input method or keyboard look like if Chinese was the dominant language?
If Chinese were the dominant language, if this were, like one of those refresh things on a Netflix, like do-over, you wouldn't have input. There is, I'm not a human biologist, I'm not a psychologist, but I'm going to go there for a moment. There is no human being alive who, when given the choice between the myth of immediacy and mediation, will choose mediation. That's what language, you realize that everything that I have been saying is built out of this arbitrary semiotic code we call language. It's all arbitrary, but no one has to look up anything I'm saying or pause me and decrypt the cipher. It's not, a second order code, but we're living in code as we speak. But from a very, very, very young age, it's A is for apple, apple, B is for boy. We have to inculcate the human species into this code to where it becomes second nature. But it doesn't stop being code. We do all that work because we want to live our lives as if it's immediate, but it's not. And so this is to say that if we imagine an alternate universe in which communication information technologies could be cellophane wrapped to the idiosyncrasies and affordances of Chinese, you best believe that it would also feel immediate, and that it would feel mediated for other writing systems that don't fit whatever the behavior of the writing system is. I think there is some impulse in, let's call it mainstream humanity. There are early adopter types. There's there's Comic-Con types. There are people that like to do this stuff. But the core, mainstream core, wants to live an experience of immediacy. What that immediacy might look like, I can't imagine it. But I do think it would be one where the experience of immediacy would be at the fingertips of, say, an average Chinese computer user. And then I'm forgetting.
Your view on LLMs.
Oh, LLMs.
Closing those.
Yeah, closing. Yeah. Well, not to sort of, I used to be a catcher, and you got to frame the pitch to get the strike from the umpire. So I'm going to frame this pitch a little bit. It's that this Chinese computing has been playing with little language models for a really long time. And Chinese computing, China has been prompt engineering for 60 years. So when I remember sitting, waiting for my son to fall asleep, I remember the first TikTok video I saw about ChatGPT last spring. And I remember seeing people kind of confused as to what this thing called a prompt is, and what is this new position called a prompt engineer, and little like online classes of better and worse prompt engineering. And just watching through the comment feed, the Anglophone world try to wrap its mind around this thing. And I remember just looking at it and saying, well, it's not called this, but China has been prompting. Prompting is hypography. That's what it is. Prompting is input. What is the way? What I type is not what I get. There are a theoretically infinite number of ways to get some sort of thing. You are retrieving from memory against a kind of predictive algorithm. You're doing, and so this gets us back to the Cold War story of the sort of really, really American, I almost think, mindset, that the story is a story of hardware. That if you can control the chips, back in the 90s, it was in the 80s, it was COCOM. If you could like control the circulation of computational goods to the communist world, you would really keep under a lid technology itself, because technology is the hardware. It is the chips. But there's another part of technology which is fundamentally cultural. And this is that for the Anglophone world, which has been fed on a steady diet of immediacy and what you type is what you get since the 19th century, since the post-American Civil War period, and then suddenly you try to just left punch them, left hook them with this idea of prompting and of this completely different way of interacting with a computer, what you get one result, and you get one kind of cognitive dissonance. If you take another community of individuals for whom prompting by other means has been the only thing on the menu for 60 years since Sinotype, everyone in Chinese computing has been prompting. And then you say, with advances in things like large language models and generative AI and GPTs and so forth, you can do this at unprecedented kinds of speeds and sophistications. The tech is obviously meaningful. I don't want to dismiss it. But there is a kind of preparedness for this. It is not so weird of a concept because I've been prompting this whole time. And literally, Chinese computer engineers in the 80s were literally laying out a timeline of Chinese computing that went as follows. The first challenge, how to get one character into the machine. That's the age of the zi. The second, which we've already solved that by this point, the second era is the age of the compound, the ci, and we're already there. The next era is going to be the age of the ji, the sentence, and we're well along our way. And the last stage in history is when? Writing itself. Writing itself. And think about where does that happen? Where's the transformational moment? The transformational moment has to do with the speed limit at play. The speed limit that has existed this whole time is the speed of will. I'm the typist, I'm the inputter, I want something, and now I want the computer to get it for me. Now I want it faster, I want it faster, I want it faster. At that point, the speed limit is human will. There's nothing that can be faster than that which I want. Or can there be? Why does what I already want have to be the speed limit? If we remove that speed limit, we then have the capacity where something can inscribe it faster than human will. And if that sounds super sci-fi, you haven't written with a writing partner. You haven't gone to a cafe with a friend. We do that as humans with each other all the time. You sell a basic idea to someone, they're like, I think you mean this. And you're like, oh my gosh, holy moly, you're right. Like, I didn't think of it that way, but like, we do that all the time with other human beings. Now we're doing that computationally. We're going to begin doing that. There is a preparedness. This is my next futurological statement on this stage like it was 10 years ago. There is a preparedness for that in many parts of the global computing world. And it's not the Anglophone computing world. It is the parts of the global computing world that, because of this incongruity between a Western-dominated information technological thing that dates all the way to the 19th century, has had no choice but to prompt for over a half century. So we'll see how this plays out.
So history, like technology, is a product of power. Thank you, Tom, for enriching
so
our
much.
vocabulary.
Thank you.
We could keep talking forever, though I feel that we are seriously testing the will of the audience and our very generous host. So we'll welcome Daniel back onto the stage. And with that, many thanks to the Computer History Museum for hosting this event.
No, thank you both so much. Please join me. It's, I'm always looking for something to bring to the table after a conversation, but like this one, the only thing I can say is that it truly was the manifestation of the mission and purpose of this institution, to be able to think it's out loud about the computing past, its implications on the present, and then there aren't any futurists who are any good who aren't historians. So I think you nailed it in the end in terms of identifying the world that we're about to enter. And without this transformation and the mention of Krememko, I knew those people in the 1970s right here. So thank you, Young, and thank you, Tom. This was a brilliant conversation. So, you know, as a museum that is focused on past, present, and future, let me ask you one more time to join in thanking our two guests tonight. So thank you so much. Great.